Hello and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance that help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I'm your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an early years consultant, trainer and author. Now, throughout this series, we will be discussing a range of topics that are aimed at supporting best practice in the early years and inspiring you with guidance and resources that will really enhance your practice. Welcome back to TTS Talking Early Years with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and today I am chatting again to Neil Leitch. We've had some really interesting conversations, Neil, about where we are in our sector. Some really bright bits, but also some not so bright and realistic bits. But in this episode, we're going to touch on special educational needs and also how they are funded or not so well funded in the early years sector. And again, the impact that that's going to have on not only those children, but on the society and the systems that those children go into.
Great, Alistair. I mean, I just to kick off, I think, clearly there are several issues. Funding is a major issue. Because children, and I hear this all the time, and we witness it, we, as well as representing 14,000 nurseries, preschools, childminders in England, we operate 41 settings, exclusively in areas of deprivation. And I think it's fair to say that we have certainly a disproportionate number of children who require additional needs. We have double the average number of children receiving pupil premium. So I'd like to think that we witness some of these challenges firsthand, and the one-to-one support that one has to give, which is not funded, is enormous. And I will tell you that this time 4 years ago, we operated 132 settings. We're not for profit, so we don't have to have a return on investment. And a lot of that is because we hold to our principles of trying to do the best by children. But it means we've closed settings.
Yeah.
It means that, we haven't been able to serve more children than we should. And it's not unique to us. I hear it all the time. I was at an event the other day whereby specialists in the special educational needs and disabilities area were telling me that just over a year ago, 31% of children with SEN were being rejected by early years settings for a variety of reasons, predominantly because of being able to not having the staff or the skills to cope at that particular point in time. 12 months on, that figure had gone into the early 50%. So there is no question, this is a concerning situation. And with all the pressures on the workforce, we have a recruitment and retention crisis. I've said many times, we've never, ever witnessed before. People having to work long hours, filling shifts for other people.
Yeah.
The margin to be able to give children support is fast diminishing. I was giving a talk alongside actually the Princess of Wales in the Royal Foundation, and I was asked about this particular question. And just before me, actually, Tony Blair had been talking, and I reminded the audience that many years ago, his government launched an initiative, which I know that you will be completely aware of, where every child matters. And I said in 2023, because it was late last year, so do the people that care and educate our children.
Yeah.
But their ability to give that support is fast vanishing, frankly.
Absolutely. And again, we've talked about this in previous episodes. We are a post-COVID society. So there's also, beginnings of research that comes out around how that affected children and their development, but also parents' perception of children and their development, even around things like their ability to play outdoors, their gross motor physical development, as well as language, cognitive development. So what we are calling SEND or special needs is now become a lot muggier in terms of children are coming into our settings who are just at a perfectly typical stage of development for the process they've been through, the experience they've been through, but they are maybe not at the same stages of development as a typical, if there is such a thing, child would have been pre-COVID. but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got a special educational need. It just means that they need to be recognised as where they are, and they are being misidentified as children with special needs. And equally, and again, we talked about this on a previous TTS podcast, some children then who have got special needs are being missed because they don't stand out in a way that they probably would have done pre-COVID. And then you've got adults who are expected to, in the situations that we've got, to notice that, to be aware of that research, to be aware of how you identify those children and what you do with it. And also for me, you've got a child who may present with some additional needs that need support, but you're never just dealing with that child. You've also got to deal with that family and deliver that message, and also educate the family around what support is available, how they can support at home. So it's way more than just when that child is in your care, what are you doing to support their additional needs? It's about how are you also supporting the infrastructure around that child.
Just about everybody I talk to tells me that more children are being presented to their settings with personal, social, and emotional development needs. And that will be at varying levels. I wish I had £1 for every manager that I've spoken to that has said to me, I spent the last few days consoling my staff because they had been bitten so many times, because they had been kicked by young children who were locked up, dare I say, in houses, in small areas, unable to play, socialize, interact, discover. Even worse if you happen to be on the 12th floor of a tower block. And that was their childhood going through the pandemic. And so we shouldn't be shocked and surprised that all of a sudden the manifestation of that is children that cannot share or are finding it difficult to share, to interact. And I was slightly concerned when I heard the other day the remarks about, isn't mental health and well-being sort of becoming just an overstated term rather than, an actual occurrence or reality? And in anything, there will always be extremes. There will always be situations where perhaps the description, the diagnosis is not valid. But we run the risk of pretending that we do not have a challenge with many children's development at this particular point in time. If we seem to think it's just life. When somebody tells me that coping with putting food on the table, with being out of a job, with dealing with the stress of a child is just part of life, I'm not sure that we should be proud of a society that thinks that is the norm. And then when you extend it back to children, I come back to the point where they have been through a fairly traumatic time. Yeah, it's a challenge. Just a few months ago, government figures, 11,625, and I've said this in a previous podcast, but 11,625 children aged 5 and lower received fixed term exclusions. 5 years of age. Something's gone wrong.
Something's gone very wrong. And I think partly as well, the policy post-COVID, which still is in existence, is about catch-up culture. So catch up, because we are not at the level that the children were at before. And again, rather than say this is an opportunity to take a pause and reevaluate what we do in terms of child development, or if you are 5 and you've not been out and you've had loads of screen time and your parents have been on Zoom calls, so you've had to learn to be quiet. So you get lots of children that lack language. I know we're going to talk about that in a later episode, but partly because for 2 years of your life, you were encouraged to be quiet because your parents were trying to earn enough money to, to put food on the table. If that comes through your setting door, it's that whole adage that we'd have in early years about meeting the child where they are and taking the journey with them, as opposed to saying, well, you should be here by now, so I'm going to push you to get there. And you might have been used to, being able to welcome children into your space and all gather together and children to sit and look at you and listen to you while you read a story. And then suddenly you've got a group of children that aren't prepared to do that, or they can't sit next to somebody, or they're biting and nipping, like you said, or kicking each other and you. The stress then for the practitioner, also when you've got other bodies who are coming in, looking at you and your practice and making judgments against standards that weren't that realistic in the first place and now are even more unrealistic, puts a huge amount of pressure on you as a practitioner to try and get children to conform to a best practice model that actually is not linked to child development massively.
I mean, parents were having to cope throughout the pandemic. I can remember one Teams call I was on, and there was a mum, a little toddler underneath. She had a packet of biscuits, chocolate biscuits on the table. And every 2 minutes, this little one was abusing the situation, going, "Can I have a biscuit?"
Well, you would. I would.
And at the end of the conversation, there were 3 biscuits left in that packet. And she said to me, "I feel like the worst parent in the world." But she was trying to cope with appeasing a child on a Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
None of that was easy for parents.
No, and parenting is hard enough when you are parenting in an everyday situation. When you are trying to also run a business or do whatever, that you're trying to mix working and parenting at the same time, and that then becomes really, really difficult. And again, it's parental guilt, and partly also fueled by social media, even during the pandemic, where other people were making sourdough and banana bread and the children were all in matching outfits playing beautifully with Lego, and you were literally feeding yours biscuits to keep them quiet. So there is a whole other aspect we haven't got time to talk about, which is the unrealistic, not only for parents, but also within the early years sector. If I flick through my Instagram accounts, which are, all to do with early years, very few people do the whole, this is my real life and it's hectic and it often looks, horrendous. You get a lot of, this is my beautifully created space. And I think we need, as a profession, for our own mental health and well-being, to be very aware. And I know we all talk about it, it's not real life, but still it ekes in and you're thinking, oh, well, my space doesn't like that. And again, parents have got exactly the same thing going on in terms of parenting. And then we as a setting or as a profession are dealing with that anxiety and expectation that they bring. So it's a complex. And but at the middle of this are children, some of whom are on a typical trajectory and some of whom will require some extra support. And it's again, as we talked about in the previous episode, it's about having the knowledge and expertise within your workforce of people who are able to notice that, to recognize it, and to even have knowledge of either what comes next or who do I ask. If you've got a depleted workforce, or if you've got people who don't necessarily want to be in that space, they're not necessarily going to have those skills, which means those children don't get the provision they might have got other times.
And you need continuity. And the reality is, again, just about everybody I speak to, and again, witnessing it firsthand, the use of agency staff has become the norm. Everybody is desperate to keep their setting open, their rooms open, to support parents and to obviously financially keep alive. But you're having to bring in people that haven't got that long-term relationship, they haven't got that attachment that's been developed. And that in itself is a challenge. So you need a stable workforce. I think a lot of our people have the skills, frankly, but they just do not have the time at this phase. And it will get worse with the new entitlement offers that come through, and you're expected to do more, etc. So there's a lot of talk about SEND, but I don't see a lot of action at this particular point in time in terms of supporting the early years sector.
Yeah, and I think, at the risk of having another discussion that ends on a slightly dour note, if we ask the question, like, how can the sector be better supported to meet this increased demand, again, comes back to policy and funding.
Yeah, funding the hours that they are there, not just the entitlement hours, for example. So if a child is there for 30 hours, but is entitled to 15 hours, you know what? You don't stop after 15 hours and put them in a room in isolation.
Yeah.
Their needs haven't changed. Your support hasn't changed, but you're not getting funded for it. You're lucky if you get funded for the first 15, regardless. So, but I'm not exactly being positive, Alistair, but I make no apology. I can't pretend.
No. And as you've previously said, there's a fight to be fought here. And if we are just complicit and say, oh, well, that's how it is, that's life these days in the early childhood development sector, then we are being complicit. And, policymakers will think, oh, well, they're quite happy. Anything we throw at them. I think part of the issue is that anything gets thrown our way, as a workforce, as a profession, we're dead flexible. We're really creative. We're really, we are, ingenious in what we do. And because it's children who are at the center of it, we find solutions. But in finding the solution, you then make people assume, oh, well, that must be all right because they found a solution. And then I think you're stuck between that and then being so browbeaten that you just can't be bothered raising your head above the parapet to say, hang on. And fair enough, you are exhausted, you're undervalued, you think it doesn't matter, your voice isn't heard, you can't make a difference. But again, I think one thing we're pushing through all of these episodes is, yes, it's difficult and we are trying to turn a tanker. But if we stop using our voices collectively, then we are going to be complicit and we're going to get more of this type of change that's going to hit our sector.
And where would these children be if our colleagues did not give them the support, care, the love, the development? Where would they be?
And I think,
can't help you. In a way, two words came into my mind when you were talking there. One was goodwill, and the other is not two words. It's a phrase actually, which is can't help yourself. And our people can't help themselves. That's so bad.
Well, and that's the one of the issues, I think, is that we meet the needs. People go above and beyond. They take up their own time. They take up their own family time. They sacrifice their own wealth and income. Again, the amount of settings you go into where people are like, well, I just bought this and I just went that and I just did that and I just stayed an extra hour. And so that's why they're exhausted. And it's because they are so committed to the job that they're doing. And you can't stop people from doing that because children are at the center of that. But as a result of that, all of that goes unseen and policy makers feel that things are working or people are complaining less and therefore the policy goes on. So we are a little bit stuck between a rock and a hard place. But again, it's about reiterating to anybody who's listening that there are people out there who hear them, see them and acknowledge this like we're talking about it now. And those people who can have an influence are trying to have an influence. But the more that people can use their own voice, even if it's in a small way, even if it's writing to the local MP, even if it's supporting a petition that comes up on Facebook, an appropriate petition that comes up on Facebook, all of those things are useful. And at that, I think it's a excellent place to leave this episode. We've got one more episode to go with Neil, so don't forget to tune in and listen to that. And in that last episode, we're going to be talking a little bit more about something we touched on in this episode, which is that language and communication gap, where that's come from, how it's impacting on the sector, and what we can do to really support children with their development. Well, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to our guest, Neil, for joining us today and providing such valuable and interesting insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Neil Leitch. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and also access exclusive follow-up content, which includes ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.